again, my name is Dermot Rodgers. I was born in Belfast, actually born on the Ormer Road, born at home at 291 Ormer Road, um, at a time in 1962, at a time when things were looking good for the people there. So my family were one of those families that dared move out of their ethnic ghetto. So we were born. Well, my father was born and raised in the market area of Belfast. My mother from County Derry. And so at that time in history, I believe things were a little bit calmer, and Catholic families were prospering a little bit. My father was a prosperous small businessman, and had a vision of living outside the ghetto, and moved up to the Ormer Road, above the bridge, and right across from the entrance of the Ormer Park. Later on, in a few years, by the late 1960s, of course, the civil rights marchers were on the go, and the British Army arrived in 1968, and I remember well my mother going out onto the streets along with all the other women, bringing tea and biscuits to the British Army, and within 24 hours, those same British soldiers had turned their weapons on us, and that from 1968 until about 1974, we lived in that home and terrorized by Protestant tartan gangs, as they were known at that time in our area, and other gangs from the Annandale Flats area and from the East Belfast in general, until my brother, who was in Long Kesh, we were threatened out of our home by a group of armed militiamen who, in the middle of the night, called my father and told him to look out the window, and he did, and saw a vehicle with machine guns pointed in the direction of our house, and they told us that they told my father that my brother, who was in Long Kesh, would be released the following day. We did not know that, but he would be released the following morning. And when he was released, if we were still there in that house by 12 o'clock noon, we'd all be killed. And so overnight, in the early morning, we were forced out of our home, leaving everything behind, and moved to the market, back home to the market. And that was my experience here. So I vowed at a very young age, I was only about 12, to leave the country and start again. And I did. I came to America May 15, 1980, and began a new life. But I've always been concerned about what happens back home in Ireland. I've always followed the politics, and been an astute student of history, and learned so much more about my own country here than I ever did there. And so that leads me into the conversation that I think you're on the cutting edge of, and that is, if there is to be a unified country, the dialogue must begin in serious now. The negotiating type of dialogues must begin now, and I think your work is seminal in starting off that dialogue by looking at every angle of the past, every possibility for the future, and putting everything on the table, regardless of how outrageous it looks at the moment. So I want to thank you for that. Yes, I came to the United States as I say, I was actually 17, almost 18, and I worked at the Cathedral of St. John in Cleveland, Ohio. And it was there that the priests and other religious inspired me to go into the seminary. And I did. And within a very short amount of time of being there, the women were martyred in El Salvador. The church women in El Salvador were martyred. And that was the first mass I ever served in my entire life, was one of those religious women who was murdered. And I served as an altar server at her mass. And shortly after that, when I was in the seminary, I was inspired to learn Spanish. And within a year, I had actually gone down to El Salvador and stayed there for a couple of weeks in that very house where she lived. And later on, spent a year right on the border with El Salvador, in Honduras, on the border with Guatemala and El Salvador. And that has been my entire life as a priest for the last 30 years. I've spent all of my entire adulthood now working with migrants and immigrants from all over Latin America. Currently, I'm working here in San Diego at the border, on border issues, working with deported mothers, deported veterans on the Mexico side, and by providing shelter and accommodation here at my home, which is a friary. I'm a missionary Franciscan of Mercy. I keep a private room in my house, open at 24/7 to receive anyone who is a migrant or a pilgrim or a traveler who might need a temporary place to stay free of charge. For years, we've talked about a united Ireland, and it's always been a one-sided vision. So from those I'm going to use some of these terms interchangeably, and I certainly know the difference. But from the Catholic perspective, or from the nationalist or Republican perspective, that is a very loaded issue. in that it means a whole bunch of denial of the past. It means maybe some denigration of people of the North, especially the Protestant Unionist people, loyalists as well. So it comes with it's a very loaded, emotionally loaded term, loaded with lots and lots of baggage of history. And so for Unionists or for loyalists, those who would be pro-British or would favor maintaining the Union, speaking of United Ireland is something that's very off-putting even to begin the dialogue with. So I always think it's best to try to find common ground in the language. And since that is loaded with so much baggage, talk of, and I think it was John Hume and others who used the terminology of a new agreed Ireland, that kind of a language. And it speaks more of an inclusive and all-embracing Ireland that's free, not free, but that is that divests from the worst of the past and is squarely looking forward into the future, to the best of the future. There is a sufficient subvention that would cause great concern. So those would be two big issues: healthcare and affordability of being sustainable. Can the island of Ireland sustain an economy, and can it be independent economically? And I would hazard a guess to say that perhaps in the beginning, not so much on its own. So that subvention would have to be some sort of agreed peace dividend, if you will, that would be shared in part by Britain and also by the European Union, and possibly from the United States. I think people throw that number around rather glibly, quite frankly, as though it's a done deal, it's a fact, it's etched in stone, it's there. But I think if you look at those numbers closely, it may not be what it seems to be. That those £10 billion may not be simply, a subvention that's money just pours in, and that would not have already poured in other forms anyway. So I think that some further investigation needs to be done on that from all sides. Again, it would be part of the negotiation. Let's put that on the table. See what that subvention really means, and is it really £10 billion? Where does that £10 billion come from exactly, and where does it go exactly? If those £10 billion were to be removed tomorrow, what exactly would that mean? How would it play out in real terms in a unified economy? And if there are any deficits upon the investigation of that, how could they be fulfilled? Could there be a peace dividend, as I said before, from some sort of funding coming from a stream that's determined for maybe 10 years, the first 10 years from Britain and from the European Union and from the United States as part of its economic aid packages to other countries? A new and agreed Ireland might return in some way, in some fashion, to the Commonwealth. And so, now you talk about who would or would not be amenable to that, but it should be at least discussed that maybe the possibility of, even if that's possible, let alone desirable, but to be counted among the Commonwealth nations. There are republics in the Commonwealth that don't have the Queen or the monarch as their official head of state in that same way, but for cultural and trade reasons, are considered Commonwealth countries. That might be a possibility.
Intriguing. Is having this long negotiations before a vote, not putting the cart before the horse, or the other way around, which should come first?
Well, that's a very good question. And in this case, because I believe that even loyalist or unionist Ireland also sees certain inevitability. We've heard from voices ranging from Paisley and others who have talked about the certain inevitability of a unification of the island of Ireland, and so it's better for everyone in the North who have a stake in that new vision of Ireland to now shape it, be a part of it, keep as much as you can. That's the whole idea of negotiation, is to get as much as you can out of the deal, knowing you're not going to get everything, but if you can get as much as you can. Certainly, if United Ireland came about for other reasons, then all of these folks would be left out of the negotiation, and everything would be imposed upon them. So I would think that you can still have a discussion while everyone under a certain understanding that this is moving toward an inevitability, because a border poll will be taken at some point. That's what's becoming clear is that a border poll is being taken. It's going to become become a reality. I think maybe not a united Ireland is necessarily inevitable, but a border poll is. Could we start with that?